My husband's family tried to cancel my wedding behind my back. My father changed everything with one phone call. 6 days before my wedding, the florist called to apologize for keeping my deposit. I was standing in the stockroom of the restoration firm where I worked, holding a clipboard in one hand and a sample of ivory silk in the other, when she told me the cancellation had come directly from the groom's family. She sounded embarrassed, as if she had accidentally opened a private letter. According to the email she had received, the wedding was off. The families had agreed to keep the matter quiet, and I was too distressed to speak with vendors myself. The message ended with my full name typed beneath a sentence I had never written. By noon, I learned that the florist was not the only one. The string quartet had released the date. The bakery had been instructed to stop work on the cake. The shuttle company had returned 3 vehicles to its weekend inventory. Even the woman who was altering my dress had received a message asking her to ship it to an address belonging to my future mother-in-law. At 2:13 that afternoon, my father made one phone call. By sunset, every cancellation had been reversed. A lawyer was driving toward the Halston family estate with 2 locked cases of documents, and the people who had spent a year treating my father like hired help were discovering that they had made the worst mistake of their lives. My name is Nora Bennett, and when I married Ethan Halston, people assumed I had entered his world by luck. The Halstons owned hotels, event properties, and restored landmarks across 3 states. Ethan's mother, Celeste, could turn a seating chart into a ranking of human worth. His father, Richard, spoke about ordinary salaries as though they were illnesses. His sister, Lydia, called herself a brand strategist, despite never working for a brand she did not partially own. My father, Frank, owned Bennett Restoration. He had started with a borrowed truck and my grandfather's tools, then built a company that saved buildings richer owners were ready to abandon. Dad rarely mentioned any of that. He wore the same brown work jacket until the cuffs went pale, and believed a person who announced his importance probably did not possess much of it. The Halstons saw the jacket and stopped looking. Ethan did not. We met after a pipe burst above one of his family's ballrooms. I was the project manager. He was the owner's son who removed his polished shoes to help carry soaked rugs. He stayed through the night, listened to the crew, and cared more about how things worked than who received credit. We spent 11 hours together before realizing we were flirting. His family tolerated me because they expected the relationship to end. When it did not, tolerance hardened into scrutiny. Celeste asked where I learned to use the correct fork. Lydia wondered whether legacy spaces overwhelmed me. Richard called Dad's company a contracting outfit. At our engagement dinner, Celeste praised how well I had adapted to circumstances unlike my childhood. Dad smiled and asked her whether the wine was supposed to taste corked. It was. The sommelier removed the bottle and no one finished the toast. I loved Dad for that, but I asked him not to fight my battles. Ethan had spent his life waiting for Celeste's disapproval to pass, and I began doing the same. Each insult seemed too small for confrontation. Together, they formed a climate, but climates are difficult to point at across a dinner table. The wedding was supposed to take place at Renmere, a limestone country house restored 40 years earlier by Ethan's grandmother, Evelyn Halston. It hosted a few weddings and foundation dinners each year, and Evelyn still lived in a private wing when her health allowed. Evelyn was 82, sharp-eyed and unsentimental. When she learned I managed historic restoration projects, she questioned me about lime mortar and drainage, then showed me water damage in Renmere's closed east wing. Later, she told Ethan he had chosen someone who could distinguish preservation from decoration. Then, she disappeared from family gatherings. Celeste said Evelyn had become frail and confused. Calls were discouraged, invitations declined by her assistant, and Ethan's brief visits required his mother's approval. Evelyn would not attend the wedding, Celeste announced, because the excitement would be dangerous. I sent Evelyn a handwritten note anyway. I never received an answer. The planning of the wedding slowly became a Halston operation. Celeste insisted Renmere required approved vendors and strict protocols. Lydia volunteered to manage communication because, in her words, my work schedule was so unpredictable. I declined and maintained my own contracts, spreadsheet, and payment records. That choice irritated them more than any argument could have. They wanted gratitude that looked like surrender. Ethan supported my decisions in private. In public, he often tried to soften disagreements instead of ending them. He would say his mother meant well, or that Lydia became controlling under stress. I knew those explanations were habits from childhood, but as the wedding approached, they began to feel like doors he was asking me not to open. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Celeste presented us with a revised prenuptial agreement. Ethan and I had already negotiated and signed one months earlier through separate attorneys. The new document was described as a routine update required by the family trust. My lawyer reviewed it and found an added schedule, granting Richard a proxy over any voting interests Ethan might receive during the marriage. It also contained a clause that could classify income from certain jointly developed projects as Halston's separate property. Ethan refused to sign it. Richard did not shout. He merely folded the document, placed it back in his case, and told Ethan that adulthood involved obligations he might not yet understand. Celeste cried quietly. Lydia sent Ethan 6 messages about loyalty. For the first time, he stopped explaining them to me. He silenced his phone and said the matter was finished. I believed him. The morning the florist called, Ethan was at a conference 2 hours away. I tried him twice, but he was giving a presentation and his phone went to voicemail. My first thought was that there had been a mistake. My second was that Celeste had decided to change the flowers. Only when the florist forwarded the cancellation email did I understand the scale of what had happened. The address looked like mine at a glance. My real address contained my middle initial. The false one omitted it and used a different mail provider. The message said that Ethan and I had recognized fundamental incompatibilities and had mutually decided not to proceed. Vendors were asked to communicate through Lydia Halston to protect my emotional health. I called the bakery next. The manager there had received a cancellation form carrying a digital version of my signature. The refund had been directed not to the card I had used, but to an account described as the Halston Family Event Office. The quartet had been told that no refund was necessary if the balance could be credited toward a private event at Renmere in October. With every call, my embarrassment turned colder. They were not merely trying to ruin a day. They had built a story in which I had collapsed, retreated, and handed them authority. If I had discovered it 2 days later, dozens of guests might have arrived to locked gates, while Celeste expressed concern for me. I drove straight to my father's workshop. Dad was in the rear office reviewing photographs from a courthouse roof inspection. He looked at my face, closed the folder, and waited. I put my phone on his desk and showed him the forwarded messages. He read each one slowly. He asked whether Ethan knew. I said I did not believe so. He asked who had access to the vendor list. I named Celeste, Lydia, the Renmere event director, and Ethan. Dad asked one more question. Had anyone contacted Renmere directly? I had been afraid to find out. He called the event office on speaker. A junior coordinator answered. The moment I gave my name, her voice became careful. She said our booking had been placed under administrative review following a family request. She could not discuss details because the estate office had assumed control. The ceremony spaces were no longer being prepared. Dad leaned back in his chair. His face did not change, but I recognized the stillness that came over him when a damaged building revealed something more serious beneath the surface. He asked me whether I remembered Evelyn showing us the East Wing. I did. He asked whether Celeste had ever explained why Evelyn trusted him to examine the property without an executive escort. She had not, and neither had he. 3 years earlier, Bennett Restoration had stabilized Renmere after a hidden drainage failure threatened its oldest wall. Halston Heritage could not secure ordinary construction financing quickly because Richard had already pledged several company assets. Evelyn had personally hired Dad, then invested in the repair through a separate property trust. During those months, she and Dad had become friends. She respected that he told her when a costly idea was foolish. He respected that she paid every subcontractor before paying herself. Before Evelyn withdrew from public life, she had given Dad a private number and told him to use it if Renmere was ever being placed at risk. "This is my wedding," I said, "not a wall." Dad looked again at the forged cancellation form. It stopped being only a wedding when they used that house to do it. He dialed. Evelyn answered on the 4th ring. Dad did not dramatize what had happened. He introduced himself, said he was sitting with me, and explained that someone acting through the Halston estate office had canceled my wedding, redirected refunds, and used a false email address. He said Renmere's staff appeared to believe the order was authorized. There was a long silence. Then a woman's voice, steadier than I had heard it in over a year, asked Dad to put me on the phone. I told her the truth in less than 2 minutes. Evelyn asked whether Ethan had signed the revised proxy. I said no. She asked whether the original prenuptial agreement remained with our attorneys. I said yes. Then she asked for the names of every vendor affected and told me not to call anyone else until I heard from her lawyer. Before she ended the call, she said something that changed the shape of my fear. Renmere belonged to her personal trust. No member of the Halston family, including Richard, had authority to cancel an event there without her written approval. She had approved our wedding herself. The line went quiet. Dad placed his phone on the desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I had expected comfort, perhaps advice, maybe an offer to pay for a replacement venue. Instead, he had called the one person Celeste had worked hardest to keep outside the room. 23 minutes later, the florist called back. The cancellation was frozen. At almost the same moment, the bakery emailed to say its refund transfer had been stopped by counsel for the property owner. The Renmere coordinator sent a formal confirmation that our booking remained active and that all instructions concerning it now required verification from me, Ethan, and Evelyn's attorney. At 4 o'clock, Ethan arrived at Dad's office with his conference badge still around his neck. He had learned about the cancellations from Lydia. She called him immediately after Renmere revoked her access to the event account. According to her, I had panicked over the prenuptial agreement. Dad had threatened the estate staff, and Evelyn's lawyer was exploiting an old woman's confusion. Ethan had left the conference before she finished. I showed him the emails, the altered refund instructions, and the false signature. Color drained from his face. He recognized the October event mentioned in the quartet's correspondence. Lydia had been planning an investor launch for a luxury travel brand that did not yet have enough funding. She had asked to use Renmere and had been refused by Evelyn months earlier. That explained where some of our vendor credits were going. It did not explain why canceling our wedding mattered enough to risk forgery. Ethan sat across from my father and pressed both hands against his forehead. He said he had ignored too many small things because admitting what they meant would require him to choose between the family he came from and the life he was building. Dad told him the choice had already been made by the people who forged my name. Ethan looked at me then, and for once he did not ask me to be patient. He gave me his phone and the access code. The messages from his family filled the screen. For nearly a month, Celeste had been urging him to spend the weekend before the wedding at a family strategy retreat. Richard wanted him to review trust documents before his marriage changed his legal status. Lydia kept offering to handle wedding logistics so he could focus. When Ethan declined, the messages became sharper. Richard wrote that the ceremony could not be allowed to trigger decisions Ethan did not understand. Celeste told him that temporary pain was kinder than permanent damage. Lydia sent a photograph of a folder labeled Continuity Protocol and joked that one day he would thank them for saving him. Ethan had interpreted the messages as pressure to sign the proxy. Now we read them as a timetable. His grandmother's attorney arrived at Renmere shortly after 5. Her name was Miriam Shaw, and she had the composed expression of someone who had spent a career letting other people underestimate how much she already knew. She brought a forensic accountant named Paul Reyes and 2 cases containing trust agreements, property records, and correspondence. Miriam asked us to meet in the estate library. When we arrived, the doors to the administrative wing had been locked, and the staff were changing computer credentials. No one had been fired. Evelyn wanted every relevant file preserved before anyone was warned about the scope of the review. The library smelled of leather and dust. Sunlight cut across the long table where Celeste had once spent an hour rearranging our guest list because she did not want my father seated near the chairman of a bank. That afternoon, Dad sat at the head of the table because Miriam asked him to. She explained what Ethan's family had hidden. Evelyn had created an irrevocable trust after her husband died. Ethan and Lydia would each receive beneficial interests at 35, but the voting rights attached to a large block of Halston Heritage shares would remain under independent management until certain conditions were met. Ethan's marriage was one of those conditions, not because Evelyn believed marriage made a person responsible, but because the original trust had been designed around a long-term succession plan. Upon marrying with a valid prenuptial agreement and independent counsel, Ethan would gain the right to appoint one of 3 trustees controlling those shares. His appointment would break the voting alliance Richard had used to control the company. Ethan turned 35 2 months before our wedding. If the ceremony proceeded, he could appoint Miriam as trustee the following Monday. If it did not, Richard's temporary proxy remained in place for another year. The revised prenuptial schedule would have extended Richard's control even after the marriage. Ethan stared at the trust summary as if it belonged to another person. He knew shares would vest, but his parents had always described them as symbolic and non-voting. Richard had told him the proxy merely simplified administration. Miriam slid a second set of papers across the table. Halston Heritage was not as healthy as its public image suggested. Richard had authorized loans for an aggressive expansion into private residences. 3 projects were stalled, and 2 lenders were demanding additional collateral. The board had not received accurate cost reports. If Ethan appointed an independent trustee, the voting shares could force an audit before Richard refinanced the debt. Canceling our wedding bought Richard time. Redirecting deposits and vendor credits toward Lydia's event served a second purpose. Her proposed travel company was supposed to attract investors whose money would enter a partnership connected to one of the failing developments. The launch was less a business debut than an attempt to pour new cash into an old hole. The ugliness of it took time to settle over me. Celeste's contempt had always felt personal. It was personal, but it was also useful. If she convinced everyone I was unstable, greedy, or overwhelmed, then my disappearance from the wedding required no explanation. If she convinced Ethan that marrying me endangered his inheritance, he might sign whatever Richard placed in front of him. They had turned their dislike of me into a financial strategy. Dad asked how Evelyn had been kept from seeing any of this. Miriam's mouth tightened. 6 months earlier, Celeste had replaced Evelyn's longtime assistant with a family employee after a minor fall. Her calls were screened. Her mail was redirected to the estate office. A physician hired by Richard had recommended reduced contact and a temporary delegation of business duties, even though no court had found Evelyn incompetent. Miriam had objected, but Evelyn, exhausted after surgery, agreed to step back for 90 days. That temporary arrangement had quietly continued. My note to Evelyn had never reached her. Dad's call was the first direct contact from outside the filtered circle in 7 weeks. Miriam had been preparing to challenge the restrictions, but Evelyn had asked for evidence before creating a public family fight. The forged cancellations supplied it. They connected Renmir's estate office, Lydia's business, and Richard's succession plan in a way that could not be dismissed as concern for Evelyn's health. At 6:15, Miriam received confirmation that Evelyn was on her way to Renmir. She had dismissed the driver Celeste selected for her and hired a private medical transport service. Her own physician was traveling with her. She also instructed Miriam to summon Richard, Celeste, and Lydia for an emergency meeting at 8. Ethan asked whether we should leave. I understood why. Every instinct he had learned in that family told him important confrontations took place behind closed doors, followed by polished explanations for everyone else. Miriam said Evelyn specifically required our presence. Dad began to object that the dispute belonged to the Halstons. I put my hand over his. They had used my name, my signature, my money, and his daughter's supposed instability. We belonged in the room. While we waited, Paul helped us build a chronology. I forwarded every vendor message. Ethan exported his family texts. Dad called the Renmir Systems contractor who had installed secure backups during the restoration. Because the property trust, not Halston Heritage, owned the network, Evelyn had authority to preserve access logs. The false email account had been created from an IP address assigned to the corporate executive floor. The cancellation forms had been uploaded through Lydia's assistant credentials. 2 refund change requests were approved by Martin Keene, Renmir's event director and a longtime friend of Celeste. Celeste entered the library with the expression she reserved for staff who had failed to anticipate her. Richard followed with counsel, and Lydia began recording until Miriam told her confidential trust materials would be discussed. They all stopped when they saw Dad. Celeste looked at me last and said she was relieved I was safe. The performance was so complete that I might have doubted myself if I had not spent the day reading her instructions. Ethan told her to stop. 2 quiet words accomplished what years of explanations had not. Celeste's expression shifted, revealing anger before concern covered it again. Richard addressed Miriam rather than his son. He said an unfortunate private decision had been misrepresented as financial misconduct. Ethan had expressed grave doubts about the marriage. The family had acted to protect guests from embarrassment, and any vendor confusion could be corrected. He suggested the rest of us leave while counsel resolved the matter. Miriam asked him to produce Ethan's request to cancel. Richard said it had been verbal. Ethan said it had never happened. Lydia claimed I had expressed doubts at a lunch 9 days earlier. My receipt and calendar proved I had been across town with a museum architect. Paul then placed the forged cancellation request on the table. Lydia blamed her assistant. Then Dad asked why the string quartet had been told to credit its balance to Lydia's October launch. For the first time, no one answered. Celeste turned on him. She said he had no standing in a Halston Trust meeting and accused him of using an old professional connection to alarm an ill woman. Dad did not defend himself. He only said Evelyn had asked him to remain. Celeste replied that Evelyn no longer understood what she asked. The library door opened behind her. Evelyn entered with a cane in one hand and her physician beside her. She looked smaller than I remembered, but not diminished. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and she wore a dark green suit. Everyone stood. She told Celeste that confusion was not the same thing as obedience. No one tried to speak over her after that. Evelyn took the empty chair beside Dad. She thanked him for calling. Then she asked Miriam to continue. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Documents, access logs, and precise questions were worse for people who had relied on authority instead of truth. Richard insisted the trust succession issue had nothing to do with the wedding. Miriam produced an internal calendar invitation titled Proxy Completion, Final Window, scheduled for the Saturday morning when Ethan was supposed to marry me. Richard said the title referred to unrelated estate planning. Paul showed that the attached document was the revised prenuptial schedule. Celeste maintained she had acted because of genuine concern for our relationship. Miriam displayed messages she sent Martin, ordering him to make the bride's withdrawal look complete before Ethan returned from the conference. Another message instructed him to keep all calls from me inside the estate office so Lydia could respond. Lydia blamed her assistant for the vendor forms. The network logs showed Lydia's biometric approval had been used. She then said I had verbally authorized her weeks ago to make adjustments. The refund destinations proved the adjustments benefited her company. Alan Pierce stopped taking notes and began whispering to Richard. Evelyn listened without interruption until Paul reached the company finances. Then she asked Richard whether he had pledged the Redburn and Ashfield properties without board approval. Richard said the authorizations were valid under his executive powers. Evelyn asked whether the board packages disclosed the covenant breaches. He said market-sensitive negotiations sometimes required discretion. Evelyn called it concealment. Richard finally lost his calm. He said the company could not survive if every aging founder and inexperienced beneficiary interfered with necessary decisions. He said Ethan's marriage to an outsider had created instability at the worst possible time. Then he looked at Dad and added that men who installed gutters should not dictate the future of a hotel group. Dad had restored the load-bearing wall behind Richard's chair. He could have said so. Instead, he asked Paul whether the lenders knew their collateral reports were inaccurate. They did not. That question changed the conversation from family control to potential fraud. Miriam advised everyone that Evelyn had ordered an immediate independent audit. Richard's signing authority over assets owned by the property trust was suspended. Celeste's estate access was revoked. Lydia's October event was canceled, and any wedding funds transferred toward it would be returned within 24 hours. Evelyn would also petition for an injunction preventing destruction of company and estate records. Celeste began to cry, but the tears were different from those she had used during the prenuptial discussion. She told Evelyn that everything had been done to protect the family. Evelyn asked which family she meant, the one whose name appeared on the buildings, or the one expected to trust the people inside them. Then Evelyn turned to Ethan. She did not offer him comfort. She asked whether he still intended to marry me. Ethan looked at me before answering. I saw shame in his face, not because he had helped cancel the wedding, but because he knew his long habit of minimizing his family had cleared the path. He said yes, if I would still have him. He added that he would appoint an independent trustee whether the wedding occurred or not, and cooperate fully with the audit. Evelyn told him that was the first adult answer she had heard from him all evening. I did not announce my decision. I was not ready to let a room full of Halstons turn my marriage into another vote. I said Ethan and I would speak privately. The wedding would remain scheduled while we decided. Celeste stared at me as if I had stolen something. She had expected exposure to make me frantic, grateful, or vindictive. My refusal to perform any of those roles unsettled her more than anger would have. When the meeting ended near midnight, Evelyn asked Dad to walk with her through the east corridor. I followed a few steps behind. The corridor had been closed during her absence. A bucket stood beneath a ceiling stain, and the air smelled faintly damp. Dad examined the wall and said someone had delayed the drainage work his team recommended. Evelyn glanced back toward the library, where Richard's counsel was packing papers, and said delayed repairs were becoming a family tradition. Outside, Ethan waited beside my car. The night had turned cold. For a while, we stood without speaking, listening to security vehicles move along the gravel drive. He apologized without adding an excuse. He said he had mistaken silence for peace and compromise for kindness. He had allowed me to absorb insults because challenging them would have changed his relationship with his parents. What happened that day was not his decision, but the conditions that made it possible were partly his responsibility. I told him love did not erase cowardice. It only made cowardice more expensive. He nodded. I also told him that one dramatic stand would not repair years of avoidance. If we married, our life could not include private support followed by public surrender. His family would not receive keys, passwords, emergency authority, or endless second chances because of their name. He would begin therapy, maintain separate counsel, and tell every guest the truth if his family tried to blame me for the disruption. He agreed before I finished. I drove home alone. The next morning, a statement from Celeste reached several relatives before breakfast. It said a vendor misunderstanding had caused unnecessary alarm and that the wedding was being reconsidered for personal reasons. The message asked everyone to respect Ethan's privacy and avoid contacting me. This time, Ethan did not wait. He sent a correction from his own account. He wrote that he had never canceled the wedding, never asked anyone to contact vendors, and never authorized statements about my mental or emotional condition. He confirmed that false instructions were under legal review and asked guests not to circulate speculation. He copied me before sending it, not because he needed permission to tell the truth, but because he understood the truth involved me. Within an hour, Celeste called him 17 times. He did not answer. The wedding could not return to our exact plan. A jazz trio filled a gap in the music, handwritten cards replaced engraved menus, and dinner moved to the glass conservatory. We removed 18 guests who responded to Ethan's correction with questions about inheritance rather than concern. Once perfection broke, it lost its power over me. The wedding began to look less like a Halston production and more like our life. The legal review, however, kept expanding. Paul discovered that the false vendor refunds were not isolated transactions. For almost a year, the family event office had been collecting rebates, credits, and canceled event balances from several Halston properties. Small amounts were routed through Lydia's launch company, then recorded as marketing expenses for the residential expansion. The total was not enough to save the failing projects, but it was enough to conceal how little outside investment Lydia had actually attracted. Martin, the event director, retained his own attorney and began cooperating. He admitted Celeste told him Ethan had privately ended the engagement and that the family needed to manage the cancellation before I caused a scene. He had doubted the story when asked to redirect refunds, but Lydia promised the transfers were temporary accounting measures. When Renmir froze his access, he tried to take the laptop because it contained messages proving he had objected. His fear made him look guilty, but the messages supported part of his account. They also showed that Celeste had planned a second stage. On the evening before our ceremony, guests were supposed to receive an email saying I had left Ethan after an emotional crisis. Celeste drafted a message for Ethan to send, though he had never seen it. She intended to bring him to Renmir after the cancellation, surround him with family advisors, and persuade him that the only way to protect me from public humiliation was to remain silent. Richard would then present the proxy as an administrative necessity while Ethan was exhausted and isolated. If Ethan resisted, Celeste planned to announce that the ceremony had been postponed because Dad demanded additional money. My father read that sentence twice. I expected anger. Instead, he looked tired. He had spent my childhood teaching me that good work eventually corrected shallow judgment. The Halstons had shown him that some people used judgment as a tool because correction did not benefit them. They had not misunderstood him. They had deliberately selected the lie most likely to be believed about a working-class father whose daughter was marrying into wealth. I asked whether he regretted making the call. He said he regretted waiting until the water reached the ceiling. That was how Dad spoke about emotion. He translated it into buildings because buildings could be opened, measured, and repaired. I understood him anyway. 2 days before the wedding, Richard asked a judge to suspend Evelyn's authority, claiming Dad had exploited a vulnerable woman. Miriam answered with normal cognitive assessments, an independent examination, and emails proving Celeste had filtered Evelyn's calls. Richard's own filing relied on Evelyn's signature for the loans he wanted protected, while claiming she was too impaired to control her trust. The judge refused his request and kept the property records under independent supervision. His attempt to label Evelyn incompetent placed his contradictions in a court file. I had not spoken publicly. I did not need to. Ethan's factual correction, the court filing, and the visible audit told enough of the story. Revenge is often imagined as the perfect speech delivered to a silent room. I learned that documentation is quieter and far more durable. Celeste came to my apartment on Thursday evening. She stood in the hallway holding my dress, which she had collected from the alterations shop by claiming she was helping with delivery. I kept the security chain on the door. She admitted she had overstepped, but said the wedding had become a weapon in Evelyn's hands. I asked why she had my dress. I told her to leave it with the doorman. If I postponed voluntarily, she said Ethan would still receive everything intended for him, and Dad's business could receive preferred contracts. She framed the offer as peace, but it had the structure of a bribe. I asked whether the offer included permission to be considered emotionally stable again. For a moment, her contempt surfaced. She said I could not understand the pressure of protecting a family institution built over generations. I reminded her that Evelyn built it. Celeste had tried to isolate her from it. She said I was enjoying this. That accusation finally made me angry. I told her I had spent the week rescuing contracts she sabotaged, explaining forged messages to people who thought I had vanished, and deciding whether the man I loved had the courage to become my husband. My father had been insulted in writing. An 82-year-old woman had been cut off from her own friends so others could use her authority. Enjoyment had nothing to do with it. Then I told her the wedding would proceed if Ethan and I decided it should, and she would not attend unless he and I invited her together. Celeste's eyes widened. Renmere, in her mind, was family territory. The idea that I could exclude her from it seemed impossible. I closed the door. Friday morning, Ethan and I met with our attorneys. We reaffirmed the original prenuptial agreement and added nothing. Ethan executed documents nominating Miriam as trustee upon the marriage and revoking every existing family power of attorney. He changed the beneficiary designations that still routed notices through the Halston office. He leased a small office for his consulting work, separate from company headquarters, and placed his personal records under independent management. Those steps mattered more to me than his public defense. They turned promises into structure. Then he gave me a letter. It was not romantic. He had written a precise account of every time he remembered dismissing my concerns about his family. He described what he told himself, what it cost me, and what he would do differently. He did not ask me to forgive him. He said that if I canceled the wedding, he would still cooperate with the audit, correct the lies, and protect me from further contact. I read the letter twice. My decision did not arrive as a burst of certainty. It formed from smaller truths. Ethan had failed me before the crisis, but he had not joined the plot. Once the truth appeared, he did not bargain with it. He did not ask me to preserve his comfort or protect his parents' image. Most importantly, the actions he took would remain necessary even if I left. I told him I would marry him. I also told him our marriage would end the first time he asked me to accept abuse in exchange for family peace. He said he understood. We invited Evelyn. We invited Miriam, who declined because she expected to spend the weekend with auditors. We invited 3 Halston cousins who had called me directly and apologized for believing Celeste's first message. We did not invite Richard, Celeste, or Lydia. Ethan delivered that decision himself in writing. He did not accuse, threaten, or debate. He stated that their actions made their attendance incompatible with a safe wedding, and that any attempt to enter Renmere would be handled by security. Richard replied through counsel. Lydia posted another vague quotation. Celeste sent only 4 words. "You will regret this." Ethan forwarded it to Miriam and blocked the number. Friday evening should have been our rehearsal dinner. Instead, we held a simple meal in Dad's workshop. Folding tables stood between tool cabinets and samples of carved stone. Maya brought trays of pasta. Ethan's closest friends supplied wine. The jazz trio rehearsed in the loading bay because Renmere's conservatory was still being arranged. Dad gave no speech. Near the end of dinner, he handed Ethan a small brass key on a plain ring. It opened the garden gate of the house Ethan and I had bought together. Dad had repaired the lock the week before. He told Ethan that a key was not proof someone belonged inside. The way he behaved after entering was. Ethan closed his hand around it and thanked him. My father's approval had never been automatic. That made the moment more generous than any blessing delivered for an audience. The morning of my wedding arrived bright and cold. I woke before sunrise in a guest room at Renmere. For one suspended second, I forgot the week. Then, I saw the dress hanging near the window and the locked document pouch on the desk where I had placed copies of every contract. Most brides did not sleep beside evidence. I showered, made coffee, and walked into the garden before anyone else was awake. Frost silvered the hedges. Staff had set chairs beneath the old elm where Ethan and I planned to marry. The restored east wall caught the first light. Somewhere inside, a vacuum cleaner hummed. Evelyn found me on the terrace. She wore a wool robe beneath her coat and carried 2 cups of tea. She said sleep had become overrated with age. We stood together watching the staff unfold linens in the conservatory. I asked why she had trusted Dad enough to give him her private number. She said that during the drainage repair, Richard wanted to conceal a structural crack until after a lender inspection. Dad refused. He told Evelyn that a building did not care about anyone's quarterly report. The crack existed whether the inspector saw it or not. She had remembered that sentence when her family began telling her that missed calls, altered reports, and restricted visitors were all for her protection. Dad's phone call had not created her doubts. It had reached the part of her that was already measuring the crack. Evelyn apologized for allowing her name and home to become weapons against me. I told her she was not responsible for choices made while others isolated her. She answered that responsibility did not vanish merely because blame belonged elsewhere. It meant repairing what remained within her power. That was the difference between her and Richard. Before we went inside, Evelyn told me the trust had received a letter overnight. Richard offered to resign as chief executive if the audit remained confidential and no criminal referrals were made. He wanted Celeste and Lydia protected from claims involving the cancellations. Evelyn had refused. She would let the audit determine what happened. Family membership was not immunity, and privacy was not a currency Richard could spend on behalf of those he harmed. Dad arrived in a dark suit I had never seen. He stood in the doorway and stared at me until his eyes shone. Then he noticed a loose hinge on the wardrobe and reached automatically for the small screwdriver he carried, even with formal clothes. I laughed for the first time that week without effort. Half an hour before the ceremony, Celeste appeared at the main gate. She came alone. No lawyer, no photographer, no cream-colored performance of concern. Security called Ethan, and Ethan came to me before responding. He said she wanted 5 minutes. I asked what he wanted. He said he wanted to hear her apologize, but he no longer believed wanting something made it likely. We agreed he could speak with her at the gate if Dad and a security officer remained nearby. I did not go. The boundary was ours, but the conversation belonged to him. He returned 12 minutes later. Celeste had not apologized. She said the audit was destroying Richard, Evelyn was vindictive, and Lydia's future would be ruined over a few transferred deposits. She asked Ethan to delay the ceremony for 24 hours so the trust appointment would not take effect before Richard could negotiate. Even at the gate on his wedding day, she was still trying to cancel it. Ethan told her no. He also told her that any future relationship would begin only after full accountability, restitution, and professional counseling. When she asked whether I had scripted those conditions, he ended the conversation. Security escorted her from the property. I expected Ethan to be shaken, but he looked clear. Grief was there, and probably would be for years. Clarity did not remove grief. It merely prevented grief from making decisions. At noon, Dad offered me his arm. The quartet began playing under the elm. Our guests stood. I saw co-workers, old friends, 3 honest Halston cousins, Evelyn in the front row, and empty spaces where Ethan's parents and sister might once have sat. The spaces did not look tragic. They looked accurate. Halfway down the path, Dad whispered that it was not too late to turn around. I asked whether he was worried about Ethan. He said he was reminding me the choice was mine until the final step. I looked at the man waiting beneath the elm. Ethan was not smiling for the guests. He was watching me with the seriousness of someone who understood that arrival was not guaranteed. I kept walking. Our vows were short. We had discarded the ornate version suggested by Celeste and written our own the night before. Ethan promised to tell the truth before Comfort could edit it. I promised not to confuse endurance with love. We both promised that no family name, including our own, would be more important than the people living beneath it. When the officiant pronounced us married, the applause rose through the branches. At that exact moment, according to Miriam, Ethan's trustee appointment became effective. No thunder sounded. No Halston sign fell from a building. A legal condition was met. A document became active, and Richard lost the voting margin he had tried to preserve by erasing me from my own wedding. The quietness of it felt perfect. During dinner, Evelyn asked for the microphone. I tensed, expecting an announcement about the company, but she spoke only about the house. She said Renmere had survived neglect, bad renovations, war shortages, a fire, and several generations of owners certain they knew better than the people who built it. Its survival depended on those willing to expose damage before decorating over it. Then she thanked my father by name. The room stood for him. Dad looked horrified. Public recognition was his least favorite kind. He tried to sit, but Maya pulled him up. The applause lasted until his face turned red. Richard had once called him a man who installed gutters. Evelyn described the buildings his company saved, the apprentices he trained, and the time he refused to hide Renmere's structural crack. She ended by saying his most important repair that week required only a telephone. Dad looked at me across the conservatory. He lifted his glass once, then sat as quickly as possible. I did not need Celeste to see it. The truth was not diminished by the absence of the person who had lied. The audit took 4 months. Richard resigned before it ended, but resignation did not stop the findings. The board restated 2 years of project costs and disclosed the loans he had authorized without proper approval. Lenders restructured the debt only after Evelyn's trust contributed new capital under independent oversight. 3 executives who had helped alter reports were dismissed. Richard remained responsible for civil claims connected to misleading collateral statements, and the board referred the scheduled server deletion to investigators. Lydia repaid every vendor credit routed through her company. Her investors withdrew, and the company dissolved before hosting a single trip. Prosecutors ultimately allowed her to enter a diversion agreement on the forged cancellation forms because she cooperated, paid restitution, and had no prior record. The agreement included community service and a prohibition on managing client funds during its term. She told relatives the punishment was excessive. None of them offered her money. Martin lost his job at Renmere, but avoided charges after surrendering the laptop and testifying. He later wrote me a letter apologizing for accepting Celeste's version of me because it was easier than verifying the truth. I did not answer, but I kept the letter with the vendor records. Some apologies are useful as evidence even when they do not restore a relationship. Celeste faced no criminal charge. Her conduct had been cruel and deceptive, but much of it lived in the space between family manipulation and prosecutable fraud. Evelyn removed her from every foundation committee and prohibited her from representing the Halston name at company events. More significantly, Ethan maintained the boundary he set at the gate. For almost a year, he communicated with her only through a therapist, and only when she acknowledged specific actions without blaming me. She preferred silence. Richard and Celeste sold their city house after the civil settlements began. Lydia moved into a smaller apartment. People who had praised their taste became suddenly unavailable. I did not celebrate their loss of status. Status had been the instrument they used to injure others, and watching it fail felt less like revenge than seeing a faulty scaffold finally removed. Evelyn returned to Renmere. She rehired her former assistant, selected her own doctors, and required that every visitor request reach her directly. She also created a governance rule that no family member could control both a vulnerable relative's personal access and business communications. When someone on the board called the policy unnecessarily specific, she replied that good locks were usually designed after a burglary. Dad repaired the east wing drainage that spring. Ethan joined the weekend crew twice, badly blistered his hands, and learned not to offer advice while carrying mortar. Dad never made his acceptance easy, but he made it real. The two of them developed a cautious friendship based on work, punctuality, and the understanding that neither would ask me to translate what the other meant. Ethan continued therapy. So did I. Marriage did not turn the week before our wedding into a charming family story. For months, a vendor cancellation notice could make my heart race. Ethan sometimes grieved parents who were still alive. We learned that boundaries are not walls built once. They are maintenance. They require inspection after storms. On our first anniversary, we returned to Renmere alone. The property was closed for drainage work, and the conservatory smelled of damp soil. Evelyn left a bottle of wine and a note instructing us to check the cork before drinking. Dad had added that line. Ethan and I carried 2 chairs beneath the old elm. We talked about the wedding we had planned and the one we actually had. The first had been designed to prove I could enter the Halston world without disrupting it. The second proved the world needed disruption. I once believed my father changed everything because he knew an important woman's private number. That was only the visible part. He changed everything because, when I brought him evidence of humiliation, he did not ask whether confronting powerful people would be impolite. He did not tell me to preserve appearances or wait until after the wedding. He looked at the damage, identified who had authority to stop it, and called. The Halstons had spent a year mistaking his quiet for powerlessness. They assumed a man in a worn work jacket would lower his eyes in a room full of expensive suits. They assumed I would be too ashamed to expose what they had done. They assumed Ethan would choose habit over truth, and Evelyn would remain behind the doors they controlled. One phone call destroyed all 4 assumptions. 6 days before my wedding, my husband's family tried to erase me from it. They canceled the flowers, redirected the money, forged my name, and prepared a story in which I disappeared without speaking. I did not disappear. I walked down the aisle in the house they thought they controlled, beside the father they thought did not matter, toward a man who finally understood that love without courage is only a promise waiting to be broken. And when the doors closed behind us, they were the ones left outside.